50 pence an hour. That is what Kaleb Cooper once said he was earning, doing the actual sums on what it costs to raise a single calf against what it sells for months later. Not a joke, not false modesty. The real arithmetic of British farming, spoken by a man who would go on to headline the single most expensive advertising slot of the entire football calendar. It wasn't Jeremy Clarkson's face that closed the deal for Hawkstone's World Cup commercial. It was the deliberate absence of it. The most recognizable broadcaster in the country stepped out of shot on purpose and handed the moment to a farm contractor from Chipping Norton who, a few years earlier, had never wanted to set foot in London long enough to get off the bus. And by the time this story is finished, you will understand why that decision wasn't sentimental. It was the smartest piece of marketing math anyone involved in Hawkstone has made yet. Here is the part almost nobody bothered to tell properly. Kaleb Cooper did not arrive at diddly squat as anyone's discovery. He was already running the place, in every way that actually mattered, 3 full years before Jeremy Clarkson ever bought it. He grew up in Chipping Norton with no farming family behind him at all. His parents divorced when he was 12. For his 13th birthday, his mother did not buy him a phone or a games console. She bought him 3 chickens. Within 2 months, those 3 chickens had become 450, and Kaleb was walking door to door around his hometown with a basket, selling the eggs himself. By 14, he was breeding sheep and working a dairy farm before school. By 15, he had bought his own tractor. That is not a hobby. That is a business built by a schoolboy with nobody's money but his own. He went on to study agriculture at Morton Morell College, and in 2016, still only in his teens, he started a farm contracting business because he had noticed something the rest of the industry had not. Farmers needed flexible, on-demand help, and nobody local was offering it properly. One of his very first customers was a modest Oxfordshire farm being run by a tenant named Howard Pauling. That farm was diddly squat. So when Jeremy Clarkson took the place over in 2019, he was not hiring a stranger to teach him farming from scratch. He was hiring the 20-year-old who already knew every inch of that land better than Clarkson ever would. The show simply pointed a camera at an arrangement that already existed. Think about what that means for how the whole story has been told up to now. Every write-up of Clarkson's farm frames Jeremy as the novice learning the ropes from a colorful local character. That is not wrong exactly, but it buries the real hierarchy. The novice owned the farm. The expert was 21 years old and had been doing this since he was 13. That gap between who owned the story and who actually held the knowledge is where this entire piece is going. Hold that thought. The early years of the show were not kind to Kaleb financially, even as they made him famous. In 2022, describing the actual economics of buying calves, feeding them for months, and selling them on, he laid it out plainly. After every cost was accounted for, the return worked out to roughly 50 pence for every hour of his labor. That was not a punchline written for the cameras. That was a young farmer doing honest maths on a trade the country still depends on, and getting an answer most people would never accept for themselves. Now, here is the part that even most people who follow this story closely have never fully joined up. While the show turned Kaleb into a national favorite, his own life outside the frame was building in parallel, on his own terms, entirely separate from Clarkson's fortune. His farm contracting firm, alongside a holdings company he set up, was posting combined profits in the region of £100,000. His media company, formed to handle his television earnings, later filed accounts showing close to £1 million in assets, with a substantial chunk of that sitting in cash. None of that came from Hawkstone. None of it came from being anyone's sidekick. He was not a discovery riding someone else's success. He was a working farmer whose business was already sound before a single advertising executive ever wrote his name into a script. That is the reframe worth sitting with. Everyone assumed the fame flowed one direction, from Clarkson down to Kaleb. The finances tell a different story entirely. And this was only the beginning of what that shift would end up meaning. Every farmer watching this knows exactly what 50 pence an hour actually feels like. Not the version with a laugh track over it. The real version, where the margins are thin enough to make you question the whole trade, and you keep going anyway because it is the only life that ever made sense to you. That is not a punchline. That is the entire British farming economy in one number. By the time Hawkstone needed a face for its biggest campaign yet, Kaleb was no longer the useful comic foil in someone else's show. He had 3 million Instagram followers of his own. He had written a best-selling book about his life, toured the country performing it live, and been invited to represent British farming at Downing Street. He had built, quietly and without a single advertising agency's help, exactly the kind of trusted public profile that campaigns usually spend millions manufacturing from nothing. So when the agency behind Hawkstone's World Cup slot sat down to plan Kaleb's leap, they were not gambling on an unknown. They were doing the opposite of what conventional advertising logic says you should do. The conventional playbook says, put your biggest star front and center. Jeremy Clarkson is a global broadcaster with decades of recognition behind him. By every normal rule of celebrity marketing, he should have been the one diving across that table on the nation's biggest advertising stage of the year. He wasn't. The advert placed Kaleb entirely in the frame, tumbling through the air to save a spilled pint, his own farming life flashing past him, while Clarkson deliberately stayed out of shot. The industry that would normally insist on the biggest name available got overruled by a simpler piece of logic. Authenticity sells harder than fame does, and nobody watching that advert doubted for 1 second that the man diving for that pint had actually earned the right to be exhausted by the end of a working day. Kaleb himself put it plainly afterwards. It had been, in his words, a long day's work for 40 seconds of television. That line means more than it sounds like. A man who once measured his labor in 50 pence an hour was now measuring it in 40 seconds of the most expensive advertising real estate British television has to offer, and getting the better end of that trade by every possible metric. The celebrity-first formula the advertising industry has trusted for decades tried to write Kaleb out of his own story more than once, quietly, by default, simply by assuming the famous face always wins. It never got the chance to prove that assumption here, because the people running Hawkstone had already worked out what the accounts and the audience numbers were plainly telling them. The formula thought it knew who the star was. It was betting on the wrong man the entire time. You cannot manufacture the kind of trust Kaleb built. You can only earn it. 1 door-to-door egg round, 1 dairy shift before school, 1 50 pence hour at a time. If you have enjoyed getting the full story behind that ad, give this video a like. Tell me in the comments whether you think Clarkson made the right call stepping out of his own campaign. And if you are new here, subscribe, because there is a great deal more of this farm's real story still worth telling.